Hi there, welcome everyone. This is the Main Street Now Conference Rewind webinar series. This is our third program in a four-part series, recapping some of our favorite sessions from the Main Street Now Conference that was held in March in Seattle. We are lucky enough to have with us today Joe Borgstrom, who's Principal of Place and Main Advisors and a longtime friend of Main Street. I want to give a couple of pointers before the program begins. First of all, hello, my name is Kelly here at the National Main Street Center, and we're thankful that all of you can be with us. If you are looking at your control panel for the GoToWebinar platform, you'll note a couple of things. One, there is a handout section. There's a PDF copy of the presentation posted there. That's for you to be able to download. If you are viewing this as a recording, the best place to access that PDF is to go to the Main Street Now mobile app from this year's conference. You can find that at eventmobi.com/mainstreetnow19. There you can find a lot of presentations from the conference and take a look back at what content was offered in case there's anything else that you missed. But that is also the best place to access, again, the handout of this presentation at a later date. Just another thing about your control panel, you'll note that you have a questions section. You are able to chat your questions in for Joe anytime during today's presentation. We will read your question out loud to make sure that Joe can answer it, and we'll also make sure to facilitate some time for Q&A at the end if time allows. Other than that, if you have any feedback or other questions following the program, you can always feel free to email us here at the National Main Street Center, and we will give you the information that you need. Okay, with that, I want to introduce our speaker for today, Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Kelly. How you doing?
Oh, I'm excellent, and I'm very excited for your presentation.
Okay. Well, then let's get to that, because I'm sure folks have other things they want to get done this afternoon. Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, Joe Borgstrom with Place and Main Advisors. Thrilled to be able to be here for this webinar. It is really exciting to talk to a little blue light on the top of my laptop today. If you do not want to have the video of me, please feel free to close it. That's perfectly fine with me. And if you've never done a webinar before, at least presented in one, it's incredibly difficult to not be able to get a read on the audience in terms of being able to see how folks are understanding what we're talking about here on the webinar. So if you have any questions at any point, please let Kelly know, chat on the side. I can't see your questions directly. Kelly will see it, and then she'll relay them to me. But from there, let's get going. What I really want to talk about and what I presented on in Seattle was about economic development on Main Street. In a lot of communities, you know, Main Street has a reputation of being kind of the party planners. And really, economic development is one of those things that is a core function of what Main Street is and what it does. And when we hear, you know, economic development in a lot of communities, economic development, the economic development agency is typically that big dog, and Main Street's that little tiny dog there at the bottom. But this idea that, you know, economic development is this big gargantuan industry, and that Main Street is just some little organization nearby that is kind of related, but people don't really know how. So the goal is, after today, that you become better partners with your economic development agencies. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that and why you should do that. So let's talk about Main Street's role in the economy. First of all, I've done traditional economic development, I've done downtown redevelopment, and I've done both sides of those. And I will tell you that when you're doing industrial recruitment, when you bring in a company from the outside, or a site selector, or pretty much anybody else who's interested in coming to your community from a traditional economic development side, they want to see downtown, because downtown is the front door of a community. So it's the barometer, it's how people determine whether or not your community is healthy. Downtown is it. They'll look at schools, they'll look at some other things, but what they will really look at, in addition to the site that they're looking at or building, is they're going to look at downtown, because at the end of the day, the people who are the decision makers, and whether that's the general manager of the plant, the owner of the company, whoever it is, they know they've got to be able to attract people to that facility, because it's about talent. We'll talk more about talent here in a second. The other reason why Main Street's important is that if we were going to put a roof over downtown, collectively, it is one of the largest employers in your community. We don't think about it that way. We have a tendency to think about all these small little cute mom and pop businesses that don't really contribute to the economy in most people's opinion. But collectively, if we were to put that roof over downtown, they would be probably one of the largest employers in your community, if not the largest employer in your community. So the other importance of this is, in order to understand the importance of Main Street and economic development, you have to kind of understand how Main Street and local economy work. So the example I always give, excuse me, is that your local economy is like a bucket of water. And in that bucket, all that water represents the money that's in your community. And every time that we buy something from outside of our community, whether it's we buy something from a big box store, or we buy something from, you know, another chain, a restaurant chain, we buy something on Amazon, that we go buy something somewhere else, every time we do that, water leaves our bucket. And in order to bring more money in, that's been really the role of traditional economic development. So economic development in a lot of communities, in Michigan, example, where I live, it was done through manufacturing. So it was done through manufacturing. It's been done through computer software. More and more, we're seeing more of the tech industry playing a bigger role in that, aerospace, those types of things. Anything that's made in your community and sold somewhere else, or services that are provided somewhere else, but the money comes back to your community, that's how you put more water in the bucket. And typically when we look at Main Street, people don't think about that. But the more competitive our retailers have been, especially in online selling, and also in tourism, where they're bringing in money from the outside, people coming to experience your downtown, those are ways of kind of putting more water in your bucket and growing your economy. The more water in your bucket, the larger the economy gets. The less water in your bucket, the smaller your economy gets. So the more ways we can bring in water to our bucket, the better off our local economies are. Main Streets play a big role in all that. So let's talk about economic development from a broader perspective. Now, typically, economic development has been about smokestack chasing. So it's about finding those industries. And in the old days, I'll tell you 20, 25 years ago, doing economic development, that the philosophy was, if you go and attract a automotive manufacturing plant, that people will then move to where those jobs are. In fact, that's how Michigan and much of the Midwest got a lot of its population. So GM or Ford or Chrysler would put up a big plant, and then a lot of people would move up from Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and other places. That has really changed. This old idea where the manufacturing community in particular hired a lot of people, that has really switched over. We're seeing way more automation than we ever have. I would say manufacturing employment worldwide last year was down 11%, and that's not from cheap Martian labor. That's from just efficiencies in technology and the way manufacturing is going. So we're seeing that change in our economies. So our practices in economic development have been changing as well. So the old way of doing economic development was you'd offer cheap land, factories would come, and then people would come. And there's really new ways about doing this, because what we're seeing, especially with this new economy, is we're seeing more higher paying jobs, but they're not reliant on road, water, and sewer and those traditional economic development measures. Those higher employers are really looking for talent. If you look at the last few really large economic development projects that's gotten a lot of attention, like say HQ2 for Amazon, that one of the top things that they were looking for was access to talent. There was nowhere on that list was, do you have road, do you have water, do you have sewer? It was about what's the access to talent there. And what we're seeing more than ever now too is that talent is choosing where it wants to live, and then we'll find a job. That's very different than the old model of people just moving to where the jobs are. People are now moving to places that they want to live, and then either finding jobs or creating jobs once that they're there. I like to give this example. This is actually in downtown Lansing, not too far from where I am right now. This used to be a part of a power plant right on the river in downtown Lansing. It has now been renovated through historic tax credits and a couple other different incentive programs. It now hosts a financial and insurance company. So we're seeing this transformation of the economy very literally before our eyes. So what does talent want? Let's talk a little bit about what the talent is. So for the first time in US history, we have 5 generations who are working side by side. So from the traditionalists, those folks are probably in their mid to late 70s, folks are still working later than they ever have. And of course, everyone talks about the boomers, and people talk about millennials. As a Gen Xer, no one ever talks about us. But then we've also got Gen Z, and we've got a number of groups there who, these 5 generations are working in the workforce now more than ever before. So there is a lot of talk about millennials, and there's a lot of talk about boomers, but what does that actually mean? So I like to provide this particular chart for folks to be able to see what, the populations, this is from a couple of years ago, but you're looking at the millennials making up 79.4 million, almost 80 million people in the United States. Boomers are 75 million. You put those two segments together and they represent 48% of the total population in the United States. So those two outweigh the other 5 or 6 combined. That's really important because they are really shifting the market in terms of what communities need to have in order to attract talent. So what I mean by that is, first and foremost, we're seeing boomers who are downsizing. The days of wanting the big yards, and if you're in a colder weather state, the idea of shoveling snow, God, I'm in my 40s and I don't want to shovel snow. The boomers are seeing that every day, lawn maintenance, all that stuff. They're just getting tired of it. Their kids have moved out. There's really no need for it anymore. Millennials, on the other hand, 88% of millennials want walkable neighborhoods. They want to live somewhere that they can walk to be entertained. They want to be able to ride a bike to work. They want to be able to live closer to where they work. So we're seeing a much bigger demand for walkable neighborhoods. Now, this is not just urban areas. These are downtowns and size of communities all over the country. So we're seeing this across the board. And there's really been, if you think about your own community, I'm sure the uptick in housing has been about downtown living or near downtown because folks really, really want this type of product available. Millennials are also the most environmentally conscious. Just from a core programming for this generation, they are thinking about things like their carbon footprint. They're thinking about, they're demanding recycling as an amenity. So by creating, these types of communities where folks don't have to use a car, then you're seeing, much more engagement from millennials. And again, this goes back to the auto independence, this idea of the carbon footprint, but being able to bike to work, being able to use scooters, being able to, do different things and not have to be reliant on a car. Mass transit is really popular with millennials as well. So this idea that we're creating these types of places that the market frankly wants. I think there's we deal with a lot of different political environments in Main Street. And I think to me that the best argument to make is that this is something that the market wants. I always come back to that. You'll probably hear me say market 15, 16 more times in this presentation. But this idea about this is what the market wants. So if we want to have communities who are competitive for economic development projects, we have to have communities that are desirable because that's what the market wants. So let's talk a little bit about children. So when we talk about millennials, we talk about how much they like walkability. But, as a Gen Xer, the first thought I have is, yeah, that's great. I wanted to live downtown. I wanted to be somewhere. But eventually, everyone kind of grows up, gets married, and has kids, right? Well, that not so much. So let's talk a little bit about households with children. Excuse me for just one second. So let's talk about households with children. Typically, when I ask a group of people saying, what do you think the percentage of households without children are in the United States today? Invariably, somebody at some point says 50%. Maybe you think it 50% yourself as you're watching this. I will tell you that it was 45% in 1965. Leave It to Beaver was still on the air. 55%, it flipped in 1990. In 2017, it was 70%. In 2023, it's 72%. It's projected to be. So the number one reason why people would want to move from downtowns and urban cores is not going to be a factor for the majority of the market. So this is a really big number. This is going to be like this. This is a 30 or 40 year trend. It's going to continue that way going throughout. So it's going to be something that we're going to need to do as, to be mindful of in our communities as time goes by. So I want to talk about economic development. As a sector, traditionally, economic development revolves around industry. That's what we've always kind of thought of when we think about economic development, but it's much more than that. It includes things like talent, either population recruitment or education around talent. Entrepreneurship is a big piece of all this. So small business ownership, tourism is a big piece, and place is also a big piece of economic development. Now, when you think about these 5 sectors of economic development, Main Street fits in about 3 or 4 of them out of the 5. So there's a big piece of what Main Street does that fits into what economic development is in 2019. Another way to put this, the state of Michigan actually has this particular phrase on its economic development, one of its economic development websites, this idea that business needs talent, talent needs place, and place needs business. So we need those 3 things in unison in order to have a really competitive community. but it's really imperative that we do recognize the role that talent has in economic development and the role that place has. So it's not just all about business, it's about those other two kind of the legs of the three-legged stool in terms of economic development in 2019. So where does Main Street fit specifically in all this? Well, you guys play a big role. We all play a big role in this industry. So when we talk about the Main Street 4-point approach, we talk about organization and design and promotion, but economic vitality is really where the crux of economic development and Main Street fit. And to me, I think economic vitality is really three main areas. The first is market information, the second is business development, and the third is real estate development. So let's talk a little bit about market information. So the first thing that you need to know about your community is what your retail leakage is. If you don't know this basic number, this is the first thing your economic vitality community should be doing, is you need to find out how much water is leaving your bucket from a retail perspective. How much is that money being spent somewhere else and on what? And those are pretty easy numbers to come by if you've got access to an Esri database, or there's a bunch of different other databases out there that can provide that information. I highly, highly, highly encourage you to start with that. Other demographic data, that is really important to know. So what your household incomes are, your population trends, age of the different age brackets that exist in your community, it's really important to know all of that information as we look at promoting your community. Rent rates are really important, both commercial and residential. If you're looking at whether it's trying to attract new businesses or trying to attract developers to redevelop buildings, you have to know some of this basic information. Part of that basic information is the commercial and residential rent rates. Without those, a developer or a business has a really hard time putting together a business case of why they should be in your community. Your business mix, you need to understand who's currently in your district. What's your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are you looking for in terms of diversifying that business mix? And then what types of businesses does your community still need? So that goes a little bit back to that retail leakage, but this idea that a healthy downtown has a strong business mix as well. And then lastly, property inventory. So this is a very core part of economic vitality. You have to know what properties are available in your downtown. This may sound like basic information. It is basic information. If you are not doing this, then you are failing to do some of the basic things that you need to be doing from an economic vitality standpoint. You have to know what property is available, what buildings are available for commercial, what property is available for redevelopment. You have to have that core information. You want to make friends with your realtors. You want to be able to promote their vacancies and their available properties. You want to be their best friend. You want them to recognize that they benefit from having a good relationship with you. So let's talk a little bit about business development. Any questions? Hold on, let me back up a second. Any questions? I'll pause just for anybody who might have questions on market information. Kelly, you get anything?
Don't see any questions coming in now. So if anybody has those questions, please type them into that question box and we'll make sure to get to you during the program.
I know it's after lunch, hopefully everybody's awake. All right, so let's move on to business development. Really, there are three areas of business development as well. So retention and improvement.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
Now that we've asked people for their questions, they're coming on in. So let's take just a pause here for one question. Two people have asked essentially, where do you get retail leakage numbers, or what's the best place to get those numbers?
So the easiest place to get those numbers is you want to talk to either your community's planning department or its planning consultant. Esri is a pretty well-known, esri.com, is a pretty well-known planning database, and they actually do some retail leakage numbers, and those are pretty cheap to get. I want to say if you had to buy it directly from Esri, I want to say it's about $100. It's nothing that's really cost prohibitive. If you are talking to your city's planning department, they can pull it for free. So getting some of that retail leakage data is really important as one of those resources.
Other question that came in is just to again kind of say what retail leakage is in order to find it, but maybe not clear definition.
Sure. Okay. So retail leakage, if you're not familiar with that, probably I should have explained that a little bit better. So what retail leakage is the difference between the amount of retail supply and the amount of retail demand. And so what that means, and there's a bunch of different categories that fall underneath that. So food and drink, shoe stores are a part of that, apparel stores, sporting goods. There's a whole different number of SIC codes that coincide with what those retail spending areas are. And that supply is the amount of supply that's available in your community. The demand is, what people are spending. So the difference in those things is either going to be your surplus or your demand. And so the surplus is if you have way more supply than you have demand, then you've got a surplus. If you got demand, then it's your availability of money in the community to buy these things and the supply that's available, then that's where money's leaving your community. So if there's a difference in the demand, if the demand is more than the supply, money is leaving your community. So that's the biggest opportunity. So those areas, say if your community has $2 million of purchasing that it wants to do every year in, let's just call it in apparel, $2 million in apparel, and there's only $1 million available of apparel spending in your community, then that $1 million is going somewhere else. So that's water leaving your bucket.
Thank you, Joe. That is a very helpful definition. We have a couple of more questions about how to tackle this. And I want to just also offer that if you're a member of the National Main Street Center, there is a market analysis guide that you can find in the Main Street Resource Center just as a supplement to what we might be talking about today. Joe, a couple of the questions are there templates for researching the market info? Could we task a committee for this or volunteers? And how often should you run the report?
So I would encourage running the report about once a year. This is something that your Economic Vitality Committee can and should do. So I would definitely task them in that. Sorry, I just had something fall over here on my desk. But yeah, it's something you can definitely task your committee with doing. And then, where you can get that information, I'd go back to working with Esri or one of the other databases to be able to get that information.
Okay. Another question's come in, so just let me know, Joe, if we need to move forward, but
Sure.
Should we spend resources chasing retail, or is downtown future in other industries? That's a good question.
That's a very good question. I would say it depends on what your market information says. If you are losing a lot of money in your community every year to outside retailers, then I would say yes, it's definitely worth that, because you're bringing more money into your community and you're employing, small independent businesses typically to do that. So you're keeping more of that wealth. So let me back up and give you a quick statistic on locally owned business versus chains and why it's important to have locally owned businesses. So there's been a number of studies done, and the best analogy or the best statistic that I've heard from any of these is that if you buy the exact same item from a locally owned store versus a chain, 25% of all that money spent more stays locally when you buy it from the local business than if you do from the chain. So if you buy, a tube of toothpaste, 25 cents of every dollar that you spend in that tube of toothpaste, whether it's the exact same tube of toothpaste or not, from a local business versus a chain, stays in that local community. And that's because that local business hires local accountants, they do their advertising locally, they do all these sorts of things all locally, whereas a national chain all does that near where their headquarters is. So this idea of, creating retail is still vibrant to your community, not only that, but if you have independent retailers versus, say, a Gap or a Walmart or whatever it is, that the independent retail actually helps bring in tourism. The number one activity for tourists, at least in the state of Michigan, where tourism is our number 2 industry, is shopping. So they're not going to Walmart, they're not going to Gap, they're going to independent retailers, because that's a unique experience, and that's something that we look at from a tourism perspective. That's why Main Street's important in that realm.
We have covered all of the questions that have come in as of now.
All right, good. So let's move on to business development. So there are really 3 areas in which business development should be as part of your economic vitality areas. Retention improvement. It is far easier and cheaper to keep a business that you have in your downtown than it is to recruit one. Not only that, but they are far more likely to expand and stay there than it is to bring somebody else in from the outside. So that's part of it. That being said, you still want to do recruitment if something doesn't exist in your community. And then we're going to talk a little bit about incentives and finance as part of all that. So under business development, the retention improvement, first and foremost that you should be doing is education with your retailers. So what are the things that are available to be able to support them? Things like customer service training, doing either marketing training for them or doing co-op marketing as part of that. Merchandising training, I will tell you, I think this is one of the biggest needs that we have with our retailers in downtowns, is that these are typically mom and pops who really love whatever it is that they sell, and they don't really kind of understand the merchandising side of it. There's an entire science around it. If you ever want to get lost in a book, there's a great book called Why We Buy, The Science of Shopping by Paco Underhill. It was a book that I read about 10 years ago, and it's completely changed my thought on the importance of merchandising, because there's so much science that goes behind that. So I think merchandising is really important. Inventory control, just understanding, the number of turns that they need. Again, sometimes when a mom and pop gets into the business, they really like whatever that item is, and so they just buy just a ton of it, and they may not understand, the amount of money that's tied up in keeping that inventory. They want to really kind of understand what their inventory churn is, how many turns they can get out of that storefront. So it's important that they understand inventory control. Accounting, this is basic stuff. I will tell you that if you've ever heard of something called the Trinity of Management, they teach this at the Harvard Business School. They say that business people are typically good at one of three things. And there's really three core parts of having a successful business. You need somebody who understands the product. You need somebody who understands marketing. You need somebody who understands accounting. So if you can get those three things, and no one person is good at all three things, I will tell you that you will probably, and I'm guessing that people on this webinar could name people right now that they think that they're good at all three things. You are not. No one is good. You might be good at two things, but you're not good at all three. So accounting is typically that thing where it's either accounting or marketing are the two areas that the tendencies of small business owners not to be very good at. And so that's, I think, two of the areas that we need to provide the most support for. So if it's basic accounting, or even helping connect them to bookkeepers or those types of people to help them kind of get through that process. Succession planning, this has become probably the number one with a bullet. This is the fastest rising issue that we're seeing, because we've got this whole generation of boomers who've been downtown retailers, and they're getting to the end of their working life. And so they want to move on and they want to retire, and the kids don't want the business. So what do we do with a viable business that the owner just doesn't want to do, just doesn't want to do anymore, and there's nobody in their family that wants to do it? So, coming up with a good succession plan with our small retailers is something that's incredibly critical. Online selling, we really need to augment the brick and mortar. I can tell you, I probably could name about a dozen businesses off the top of my head who are downtown businesses, brick and mortar businesses, who do 50% or more of their sales online. It is so important that we open that avenue, and that our retailers aren't necessarily looking at Amazon as a competitor, but as a tool for them to be able to help sell their product as well. So it's really about trying to how you leverage those types of things. The other thing that we can be doing for our businesses is communication. So it's them understanding what each other are doing. In Community of Clare that we used to work in quite a bit, all of those retailers met about once a quarter, and they talked about the product that they were getting. So they knew other people were not going to carry the same product, and they knew what everybody else was going to be carrying, but they didn't try to compete with each other. They tried to carry complementing things. Now, the phrase I always like is it's co-opetition. So you can cooperate and still be competition and still kind of refer folks to each other. But this idea about what all is going on in each other's stores that they can help cross promote each other. Business assistance teams, if your community is not doing one, this is a little bit more of an advanced tactic. This is where you get volunteers who are really good at those things like accounting and marketing, and you want real estate agents and lawyers as part of this team. So if a business is having issues, that you've got this team in place that can go in and help these small businesses kind of work through whatever it is that they need. So those, I think, are pretty valuable teams to have. So potential projects that you could be doing around this, education sessions, I think, are really important. Sometimes it's hard to get people to show up to them. My biggest piece of advice is do them when they can do them. So that's going to be either early morning or late at night. The life of a retailer is not sexy. It is not It is not something that people get all that excited about doing sometimes, because it's hard for them to fit in, time to do this stuff. So doing things when they can do that, I think, is really the most important part of all that. As a Main Street organization, you can hire consultants to come in and do this stuff. You might be able to partner with your state coordinating agency if they have one, but be able to do in-store consultants for merchandising, because most mom and pop retailers can't afford to do a merchandising consultant on their own. But if you're able to help them pull together 4 or 5 other merchants, then that becomes a lot more affordable to do. Secret shopping. This is an area that I know about 1 million people who would love to do this for a living, but being able to find somebody who will come in, and this may be something that might be a good partnership with another Main Street community nearby, where you guys can secret shop with, for each other, but develop a template where you can go in and, evaluate a store, but not do it in a way where, the storekeepers necessarily know while you're there, but they certainly participate in that. We did this from a security standpoint when I was in Owasso. We had a lot of shoplifting, and we actually worked with the sheriff's office, and the sheriff sent a deputy in to shoplift with about a dozen stores, and then we brought everybody in, and when they came in, all their merchandise was on the table, and we had to explain to them that, the sheriff's office stole from you, and here's your stuff back. But this idea of, it's the experience of the consumer, but it's also from a theft prevention standpoint for the retailers themselves. Institutional procurement training. This is one that I think is really overlooked. If you have a college, if you have a hospital, if you have any entity, and this can be a county government even, who buys anything on a pretty regular basis, of connecting them with the downtown retailers or restaurants for catering when they need those types of activity, those types of either items or activities like catering. Getting them connected to the people who spend a lot of money on this stuff is another way of helping keep that water in your bucket. Catering Showcase is a good example. I talked about co-op advertising under marketing. You can certainly do this as a promotion, as a co-project with promotions. Just because I've listed it here under economic vitality, there's so much stuff that can go across committees. Advertising and marketing, obviously, with promotions. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about on the real estate side that should and can and should be done with design. But so I wouldn't let the silos of the 4 points necessarily do that, because they're not supposed to be silos. They're supposed to be areas in which they interact. So don't get hung up on that. But this idea that you can be partnering with some of the other committees to do that. Business roundtables. This is another area where just getting the groups together to talk about what their common issues are. Sometimes it's HR, sometimes it's payroll. It's, there's some other just hardcore business stuff that just getting them around the table to talk to one another is incredibly beneficial as part of all this. Business owner Facebook groups. This is another quick, cheap, easy way to get all the owners being able to talk to each other from a communication standpoint. There's a couple of communities I know, as I was actually pretty thankful to be let into one of these groups a few years back, where the owners of all the small businesses can talk to one another and say, all right, here are the issues that we have. It was all around the Main Street group. So they had their own group in which they could talk to each other. And it's on a medium that folks are using already every day. Let's talk a little bit about business recruitment. So first and foremost, marketing materials. You have to have that data we talked about, market information. You have to have that available for potential businesses, along with that inventory. So that first part is the data. What do you have to offer from a market standpoint, from an inventory standpoint? But that second piece of putting it all together, making it look nice, and putting it as part of an attraction packet. Having a vacant storefront strategy is really important. I think everybody has seen those signs that say this store isn't empty, it's full of opportunity. It's almost become a little cliche. But this idea of how are we addressing these empty storefronts? Because I can tell you that even just recently, as this week, it's Wednesday. On Monday, I was working in a community where they have a number of vacant storefronts downtown, and they're filled with storage crap. They're just full of stuff, and it makes the downtown look junky. And it's not the fact that the buildings are in pretty good shape, it's just how the empty storefronts are being used. So having an active vacant storefront strategy is really important. In your business recruitment, you want to identify your targets. What types of businesses are you going after? You don't go hunting by saying, I'm going hunting, and you grab a gun and you go out in the woods. What are you hunting for? Are you hunting deer? Are you hunting for bear? Are you hunting for what? Are you going fishing? What are you going to do? And so you have to identify specific targets when you go out to do business recruitment. So my number one piece of recommendation for this is you want to go after existing businesses who are successful, who may be looking at an additional location. You don't want to get into a war with your neighboring communities about you stole this such and such business. You want to talk about expansions and successful businesses who might want to come to your town as a second or multiple location business. Entrepreneurs, you already have entrepreneurs who are probably in your community, who they're on Etsy or they're on some other website, and they're working out of their basements and they're working out of their garage. It's trying to identify those folks and helping them to move into another space. I'm seeing a lot of pop-up retail. If you guys have seen the shed ideas where they've got, call it 10, 12 sheds, they're 10 by 10 sheds that allow somebody to come in and rent a shed for a couple $100 a month. And they're open on the weekends and they're able to kind of try out their retail wares, whether it's, if they're making bracelets or they're doing whatever it is that they're doing as far as making things and selling them on Etsy, to give them kind of a brick and mortar space for them to kind of test out whether or not their retail concept makes sense. And what that does is then that starts becoming kind of an incubator space where as the retailers that are there, they become better and better at what they're doing, and they're growing in demand, and then they're going to end up moving to an empty storefront. So it's identifying those folks, and then you can do that as part of your business recruitment strategy. And then lastly, as a Main Street manager, you should not be doing recruitment. Business owners are the best recruiters because business owners talking to other business people makes way more sense than sending the professional staff out to talk to them. You're professional staff. Your job is to go out and get people. You have to have the other small business owners who are either recruiting complementary businesses or, God forbid, competing businesses. Restaurants are notorious for not wanting anybody else to come into town. You have to have more than one restaurant in town for your restaurant to be successful long term. You have to have a cluster of restaurants in order to do that. Food trucks fight the same thing. Food trucks, I'd be actually a huge fan of. I've seen it numerous times where they come into a market, the brick and mortar restaurateurs are all up in arms because we pay property taxes, the food truck doesn't. They're also there all the time and they can take advantage more of the market, and maybe they don't, and that's why the food truck shows up. But when the food truck is there and they're successful, they will convert to a brick and mortar. I've seen that probably happen a dozen times in the last 2 years alone. So it does happen, and it can happen, it should happen. So that's one of the things, but having those business owners to be able to go out and do that recruitment, I think is really important because they're the ones who are also already making money and they want to be able to tell that story to other business owners. This is a great vacant storefront strategy. This was actually in River Rouge, Michigan. Ben Muldrow, who did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, Ben did this one when we worked with Arnett Muldrow and Associates on this particular project. If you're not familiar with River Rouge, it's immediately south of the city of Detroit. It has a vacancy rate of about 60 or 70%. It's a pretty tough place, and it's gone through a lot of economic decline. Ben worked with them. They developed the overall community brand of this is where hard work lives. And then we kind of spun that with their vacant storefront strategy and created this is where opportunity lives as a vacant storefront strategy there for them in River Rouge. Any questions on business recruitment before we get going?
Yeah, a couple of questions have come in. One question is any examples of vacant storefront strategy ideas?
Well, there's one right there. Well,
absolutely.
In this particular case with River Rouge, I mean, it's pictures of their history, and I love when communities do this because it's turning a little bit to that and helping to do that. The other thing I've seen be really successful is partnering with some of the elementary schools and doing artwork. So using the storefronts as displays for the couple of the elementary schools art classes. So using that as a reason to help draw people downtown and see these storefronts. The other thing I think is really important is when communities are having a big event that they work with the realtors who are representing these vacant storefronts and having the buildings open. I've seen a number of communities who do this, and it's pretty successful no matter when they do it. So they make sure that the doors are open when you have the most amount of people who are coming in your community. So you allow folks who may be in town for a festival or an event, and who may own a business in a nearby community who can come in and see this and kind of not feel pressured by a realtor or anything else like that, but come in and see the vacant property and go, oh yeah, this looks like a good spot for us. We might want to come
here. Thank you, Joe. Another question that came in is, retailers are increasingly asking for pedestrian traffic data when looking for location options. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, the hardest part about pedestrian foot traffic is that it's hard to come by. You actually have to do a lot of that yourself. There isn't a database for foot traffic. I think part of the way you can do that is monitor the amount of employees at nearby anchor institutions or nearby large employers. So if you have a pretty sizable downtown with a couple of big offices, you want to be able to know how many employees work there, and so you can start to quantify that a little bit. But some of that's just going to have to come from just good old-fashioned surveying and doing some data counts on weekends, and being able to actually, if you can talk with the police departments, are usually pretty good at population estimates as well. So you can start to get a little bit more of an idea on that. But outside of creating original data, it's really hard to come by that data. So that's just, unfortunately, the answer is just it's old-fashioned hard work accounting.
Thanks, Joe. A couple of questions that have kind of come in that are similar is a little confusion about how to best get other businesses to recruit businesses. I think one participant said earlier, said they're so busy that education sessions must be either early in the morning or late in the evening. So where are these folks finding time to help you do that, and how can you incentivize them?
You're going to find, I think there's going to be folks who are busy from morning till night, and you're going to find other folks who, if they make time to be part of your committee, then they're already recognizing the value of being a part of something that's going on with Main Street. So I think that's a little bit easier to sell. I'd start with your committee members who already understand it and are making time for it. There's an old phrase, which is, if you need something done, you find somebody busy to do it, because they're the ones who find time to get it done. So I think that's part of that strategy, is talking with your existing committee members. If you've got a business owner in your community who never participates in anything because they never seem to have the time, I wouldn't bother with them, because they're not going to, they'll be the one who probably automatically complains anyways. So I would start with your committee members who are business owners and start with that group. To find a restaurateur who's willing to go out and recruit another restaurateur, I mean, that's the ultimate goal. It's very difficult. I don't think every community can do that. I think it's difficult to get a restaurateur to understand that. So part of that is just trying to find out, who's willing to do it. And most of the times, people aren't even asked, because there's an assumption that they aren't willing to do it. I think that there is a little bit of prestige there to say, we want you to represent our community and to go and help us recruit specific businesses. I think the challenge too is you can't say, we want to use you for business recruitment, because that's kind of this big, unending, vague request. If their ask is, we would really like you to go talk to this florist over in this town about coming and setting up there, that's a finite request. You're not asking them for 20 hours of time next week. You're asking them to spend an hour to go over the next town over and ask the florist if they're interested in having a second spot. So part of that is limiting what that ask is, but not making it a big vague ask of just saying, we want you as part of our recruitment committee.
Thank you, Joe. Another one is just a suggestion that someone also sent in to encourage that folks, in thinking about empty storefronts, also think about cross promotion between other businesses in the community. So that's just a wonderful suggestion to also
Absolutely.
hear.
Love that idea.
Okay. Another question about succession planning, just in resources available to help with succession planning. Any other thoughts on how to find the best way to help businesses plan for the next step?
I would say probably you want to talk to your small business and development centers, your SBDCs, and any of the SCORE programs, those types of things. You want to talk to the groups that are talking to entrepreneurs who are thinking about starting a business, because I think those are the folks that are going to be the greatest source of people who may be the potential to take over an existing business. I think so many times people have this thought that they've got to create a business themselves from scratch, and sometimes they want to, and that's okay. But if you've got a group of people who just want to do something and they're not sure what, introducing them to those opportunities, I think, are really important. You got to go to where they're going. So it's your small business development centers, and that's your SCORE programs and or even chambers of commerce. because some of them run some of those business. What am I calling it? Small business development. It's not SBDC, but it's like business coaching types of programs.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. That's all of the questions that we have coming in currently.
All right. Let's see. We have about 15 minutes left, right? So let's talk about incentives and finance, because we're going to talk about real estate here still yet too. So incentives and finance, I think, is something that you need to be using in tandem. This isn't a kind of a standalone. So you want to use this both on the retention and improvement side, as well as recruitment, as well as real estate. And most of the incentives that I've seen and both from a cash standpoint and financing standpoint, they're more targeted towards real estate, because there's typically a longer lasting lifespan with real estate, because it's creating real property versus operations or stuff, inventory that could go into a small business. But there are revolving loan funds. Some of your EDCs may already have those. Rent subsidy program. Howell Main Street program actually just did this with a local credit union, where they're doing a 6-month rent subsidy program for qualifying businesses. And I believe, yeah, Kathleen presented a couple of weeks ago here in one of the webinars, but the Howell Main Street program in Howell, Michigan is actually doing a rent subsidy program. So if you're interested in that, it's HOWELL, Howell, Michigan, who's doing that. I think it's a really cool program. So let's talk about real estate development. To me, there's really kind of 4 levels of action when it comes to real estate development. So it's promotion of opportunities, it's what we call planning and pre-development, there's facilitation and incentives, and then lastly, development. So if your communities, your Main Street organizations think about doing development themselves. So let's talk about promotional opportunities. I talked about it in the data part, but this idea of the properties that are currently for sale, any of the publicly owned properties in your community that, it may be tax reverted. I don't mean this by meaning City Hall, but I mean like anything that might be tax reverted, or vacant parcel that the city happened to take possession of. Vacant properties or underused properties, I think, are really important as well. So those are those properties that have been sitting there for a while. They may be owned by somebody out of town and nobody's just ever asked about it. I'm not saying that you don't have occasionally people who just own a piece of property, they're not from town, and they have an unreasonable expectation of what that price is. I'm sure that happens, and I'm sure that's happening probably in many of your communities. But these are at least the places that you want to start, is those who are actively for sale or actively looking for rent, publicly owned, the vacant properties, and the underused properties as those areas that you want to look at promoting. So for the properties currently for sale, they have to be proactively marketed. So your realtors have to be engaged in this. Typically they are, but you can be using their materials to help sell the location as well. You can be putting that kind of stuff on your website. It should be kind of a base level of information on your website, but you can and should be linking to the realtor's website. I think a lot of times, historically in economic development, realtors have been very suspicious of economic development agencies, because for some reason they think that they're, competition, and they're not. Neither are you. You want them to get their commission. You want them to be able to fill those storefronts, and making sure that they understand that. So you want to promote that on your website. You want to promote that on your social media channels. Other industry sites, if you're not familiar with OpSites, it's a free website. I believe it's opsites.org or .com. And that's an opportunity for you to be able to list vacant properties as well. Same with Zoom Prospector. Various state economic development groups have memberships, so it may be something that you can actually access for free. But I would check out those 2 particular websites in addition to MLS, and making sure that your sites are listed on those types of websites. For the properties currently for sale, at a minimum, you want to have a recent photo of the property. You want to talk about what square footage is available on that property and what the sale price is or lease price, and contact info at the realtor. It's the very minimum that you want to have on there, including zoning. So is it zoned for commercial? Is it B1, B2? And then have some of those definitions available. And of course, you want to link to your realtor's website on that. Now, if you want to be a little extra, as the kids say, you want to be able to put that in a format that's a downloadable PDF. So it's something that you can click on and get more information. In addition to having a link to your realtor's website, it's actually a piece of branded marketing material that can be downloaded. Doesn't really cost you anything to produce. You want to be able to put it on a location map, so folks can see not only within the downtown, but within the greater region where you are. Any renderings that have been done on the particular property, I know a lot of state coordinating programs will do design services. So if there's been any design services done on a particular property, you want to have those available as well. You want to talk about what the community wants to see there. What's the desired project description? What is it? Are we looking to have, you want apartments on the upper floors, and we're looking to have, a coffee shop or restaurant on the first floor, or, kind of talk about what your targets are and what that space could be used for ideally. And then that, of course, leads into having some of that market information saying, here's what our retail leakage data says. But you want to make sure that you create a custom marketing piece for each property. Don't assume that just because you have a market section on your website that people are going to look at the building and then go over and do that. If you're going to create that PDF, put all that information in the PDF. That way anybody who's interested will already have it. I will tell you right now that people already are on your website. They're looking for these properties, and you may never know who they are, and you may never see them because they're going to do all their research online first before they ever set foot in your door. So make sure that this stuff is on the website. That's the most important part. Now, Louisiana Main Street, through their Office of Cultural Development, and they do a really nice format. I give a lot of credit to Ray Scriber and his group. This is a great, and I'll show you the next couple of slides of all the possible information. I would list this under ideal. If you're looking to steal a format or the Main Street way of R&D, rip off and duplicate. Ray's group does a great job with this, and I've seen a number of communities in Louisiana who use this effectively. But you can see building information, building inventory information, what the millages are, the various incentive districts that are there, and number of floors, potential community needs. You can see that's a section on there as well. Tax rate, millages, annual taxes, utilities, all that stuff. You can see sales information, whether it's for sale or for lease. All of that. I think this is a really good format that if you have half this information, then I think you are light years ahead of other communities who you're competing against. So try to get all of it, but if you can get half of it, you're way ahead of where everybody else does. So before we move on from that, any other questions on promoting opportunities?
No questions have come in yet. If they roll in, let's take them at the end and move forward.
All right. I want to talk real quick about real estate projects themselves and why they die. First of all, it's because they're not. The number one reason is because they're not feasible. It means the market rents don't meet the same amount of cost that needs to go into a property. So that's the first way. It's not feasible. Community opposition. So it's NIMBYs and cave people, the citizens against virtually everything. The people are not in my backyard. My new favorite one is bananas. Build absolutely nothing near anyone. So the people who oppose the particular project, unclear processes. I can tell you I've worked with communities where they had a big spurt of development and then nothing happened for 5 years. And we go back and talk to them and say, well, why hasn't anything happened? They said, well, so-and-so with the city quit and nobody else knows how anything works. So having a clear idea what your processes are, not knowing what the market is. So again, seems like a nice town. I don't know what they need. Don't know what the market will bear there. A lack of financing as part of that. But I will tell you that of these 5 areas, 4 of them you can address as Main Street groups. And so we'll talk about that. Let's talk about the development process. So planning and pre-development. Planning, pre-development, and development are the 3 stages of development. So I like this, the 6 Ps. It's the proper planning prevents poor performance. So if we're talking about the NIMBYs and the cave people, we want to make sure that you understand kind of what the process is. If we're going to drive development, that these are the steps. And to me, I think this is probably the most valuable slide of everything that you're going to see today. I know that we've got the handouts available to download. I highly suggest doing this. But if you want to know how development happens, this is the slide right here. So it's everything from master plan, this is that pre-planning stage, to redevelopment areas being prioritized, to aligning your districts. If you've got a principal shopping district or a bid district or whatever, whatever those individual tools are at your local level, that's where you want to have it. You want to identify sites, you want to have your market analysis done, and then you want to go through an RFQ. I think I have a section on RFQ here in a second, so I'll skip that. But you can go through this whole section, and this is really kind of a step-by-step guide on how you want to look at development from your perspective as a community. So let's talk about a little bit more about that. Master plan, I just talked about these areas, so I'm going to skip through this real quick. this is a free resource for you, by the way. In Michigan, we're really fortunate. We've got a program called Redevelopment Ready Communities. It's under a group called Michigan Economic Development Corporation. It's our state economic development group. Their website is miplace.org. They are really good. They've got a best practices series where they talk about what communities can be doing to best align themselves from a planning perspective to be ready for redevelopment. And I think this is really an outstanding resource that I really encourage you to check out. So it's called the Redevelopment Ready Communities Best Practices Program. And I would really make sure you check out those because I think that does a lot for on a municipal side. I know we're kind of running up on time, so I want to make sure I try to get through all this stuff. I want to map the municipal processes. I think that's really important for communities to do. So this isn't just your ordinances, but how does stuff work? And then what is it that can be done that can be streamlined? So that doesn't necessarily have to go to a planning commission or go to a ZBA or any of those things. What is it that you can do as a municipality to kind of help make that process go a little bit faster? The other thing I'd tell you is you want to make sure that your redevelopment processes are consistently applied. So it's that, if a developer knows it's going to take 180 days to get through your process and it takes 180 days, they're okay. If you tell them it takes 90 days and it takes 180 days, they are not okay. So you got to make sure that you're being consistent in how you apply those sorts of things. This is a great project that was done by the city of Grand Haven. Their economic vitality group did this. They went through and they mapped all the processes that the city has and explained with the city planning department what the step-by-step is in order to do anything that you want to do in the city. And they did it from there's a timeline of how many days should it take. This is a pretty two-step process, but here's a site plan review process that takes 8 steps. And it kind of tells you exactly what it is that you need to do and who you need to contact in the city to do all this stuff. To me, I think this is one of the best products that a Main Street organization can do to help facilitate redevelopment in their community, is helping to map that process. Identifying the opportunities in your community, you want to look at what those factors are for reuse. So the first rule of real estate is location, location, location. So you want to talk about that. You want to talk about the condition of the building. So that building, if a building is pretty well gone, you don't want to put it really super high on your redevelopment list. So the lower the hanging fruit, the less that has to be done, the higher the priority is for it to be redeveloped, because that's the one that has the least amount of work to have done on it. You want to take a look at that site in relation to the services and the infrastructure that it has there. The site control, who owns it? Are they willing to own it? And if you're a Main Street organization that wants to help facilitate, you don't have to own the building. You can work with either willing owners or do what's called an option, where you have the option to buy the property. You have basically a right of first refusal, so no one else can come in and buy that particular building. Excuse me. But creating site control is really important in all this. Is the site a community priority? Is this a building that we want to save? Do we know that the community wants to rally around this? So those community priorities are important. Of course, market feasibility, what your rent rates are. You have to understand what all that stuff is. So when a developer puts together a financial pro forma, that market feasibility is pretty high on that list, so they can understand, how they're going to make money off a particular project. So facilitation and incentives, this next step, you want to prioritize those things that are publicly owned, that they're vacant, that they're underused. You want to initiate contact with folks and just say, are you interested in selling? If they're not currently listed, are they willing to sell their properties? How much are they be willing to sell their property for? And try to get their interest in selling. Work with a local realtor. Again, you don't want to compete with them. You want them to be your friends. You want to work with them closely. You want to offer to promote and help them develop what's called an RFQ. Now, an RFQ is called a request for qualifications. It is not an RFP. Request for proposal asks for a very specific and finite particular project from a developer. You don't want to go that route because they're expensive and developers hate doing them. You want to go through an RFQ, which asks for qualifications. You want to find developers who've done this type of project before, know how to do it, and that you can identify, the challenges of a particular property together. RFP and RFQ. RFP was really designed around a municipal procurement process that, you're buying everything of known quantity. When you buy a piece of property, whether it's land or a building, there's so many unknown quantities in that building, whether it's lead and asbestos or what might be in the ground once you start digging, that you don't want to have to hold somebody to a proposal that defines what exactly that you want to do, but you want to be able to work with somebody who knows what they're doing and knows how to handle the situation. So that's where I think the RFQ is superior to an RFP. And then after that point, you want to identify if there's a gap between what needs to be done and what needs to be spent. Then that's where you start looking at incentives. I talked a little bit about RFQ versus RFP already. So it's built on procurement. It's best for defined projects with known variables. Real estate's not that. So RFQ really builds a relationship, and then unknown variables, again, we don't know what all exists sometimes in the dirt and inside the building itself. So it's important that you get into a relationship with a developer who knows how to do this stuff, and not necessarily get to a point where you're looking for a finite product on the onset when there's so many unknowns about a particular piece of property. This is give an example of RFQ. This is one we did recently in Gladstone, Michigan. They had a piece of property. It was 40 acres adjacent to downtown on Lake Michigan. And they actually worked with Michigan State University at identifying, working with the community, what kind of residential would look good there. And we worked with them to identify market needs and feasibility for all of that. How are we doing on time? We are almost at overtime. So let me finish this up. Know your developer target. There are 3 types of developers. There are mom and pop developers. These are the people who are dentists and attorneys and doctors in your community. They want to do something good. God bless these people. These are the people that you want, because these are the people who, they're not going to turn around looking for a 7-year ROI. They're going to hold on to that property for a long time. From there, sometimes you get mom and pops who've gotten pretty good at it, and they start buying more and more, and they become what's called a mid-sized developer. So maybe they're active in a couple of communities. They probably own between 5 and 12 properties, and that's kind of what they do now. They enjoy doing that. And then there's, of course, the bigger developer. So the larger your city, the larger your developer typically is. So if you're a small community, if you're under 25,000, you're probably dealing with mom and pops to mid-size. If you're under 10,000, you're almost exclusively dealing with mom and pops. So it's understanding kind of your developers and what their level of sophistication is and how you can work with them individually. Again, you want to identify your possible incentives. There's 2 types of incentives typically. One is by right. The historic tax credit is one of these things. So you're looking at the federal level, 20%. That means it's 20% of the project, no matter whether or not what their financing looks like. So it's 20% of the project, period. Other types of incentives are designed to fill gaps. So if they're able to put together a project and they're still missing $50,000 that doesn't make sense, there are some incentive programs that are designed to fill those types of gaps. I identify different incentives. I won't go through all these, but these are just a non-exhaustive list of potential incentives. I'm a big fan. I was originally not a fan of opportunity zones. I've come around on them. I think those are an emerging area that we haven't seen leveraged properly yet, but they have an incredible amount of opportunity. Of course, I'm a big fan of federal and state historic tax credits, especially when you can stack them. Let's see, developer red flags. To me, if you want to know whether or not a developer is lying to you, there's some red flags. So the first one is they don't want to share incentive. They don't want to share their financials. They want incentives, but they don't want to share their financial information. They just want you to write them a check. That's not a good developer. They might have a private mortgage, so they're going to do a development project, but somebody else that's not a bank is going to write that check. You want to find out, what the loan rate is. I've personally worked with a developer whose father was going to write the mortgage, and dad wanted 2% more than what the bank was willing to give, and we said no, we're not going to give any incentive to that. You want to look at your rents per square foot. If they're charging what's below the market, then that's going to be an area that they're kind of fudging the numbers. Same with the cost per square foot being higher than what the market typically is, or if they're overinflating vacancy. So if they're going to say, well, we think there's going to be a 20% vacancy and there's really a 5% vacancy, that's a way that they can kind of skew their numbers a little bit to make it look like it needs incentives when it really doesn't. So lastly is development. If you want to actually get into development yourselves as a Main Street organization, you can do that. And I would recommend, unless you're 7 to 10 years old as an organization or older, not necessarily to go there, but you should tread carefully. You should start small with smaller projects, 1 and 2 story buildings. Don't go into a 5-story building that needs to be redeveloped. You want to get a team together. So you want to have somebody who's good at construction, somebody who's good at finance. You want to have a lawyer. You want to have a realtor. You want to have a group of people who know what they're doing and have gone through this type of projects before on your team to do You want to understand what's wrong with the property. If you think there's nothing wrong with the property, then you don't know the property well enough. So there's always something there. Pro forma development, you want to be able to put together a financial package so a bank knows what it is and how how you're make money from that particular real estate project. Always discount your income. So as I talked about, that might be a red flag as you're talking about a developer. If you want to make sure you don't get underwater on a project, that you want to make sure that you're underestimating how much income you're going to get versus overestimating or being too optimistic. Because if you underestimate and make more, that's fine. If you overestimate and make less, that's not good. Banks don't like that. You can't make mortgage payments and you end up losing your job. The organization may fold. So you want to make sure that you're at least being conservative about how you look at this. Same with higher costs. Take whatever number you have, multiply it by an additional 20%, and that's probably going to be close to what you're looking at the end. And then use your organization status. If you're a 501c3, try to see if you can get a building donated, because then they can do that. Or you can at least have that donated, and then you can use that property and sell that property. So they get the tax write-off. You might be able to get something out of that building in addition to having a good project done, but you might actually get sales money out of that to be able to help fund your organization. And then always have an exit plan. Don't ever take a piece of property or go into a project and not know how you're going to get out of it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get out of that deal one way or the other. And you'd rather have it be in a way that you know what you're going to do, how you're going to get rid of that particular piece of property before the bank does it for you because you can't make the payments. So you want to make sure you have an exit plan in all this. So my apologies, because I know that probably last 10 slides or 15 slides went a little fast, and that was probably some pretty meaty stuff. So I'd be happy to stick around, because I know not everybody can stick around for the next probably 15, 20 minutes if you had budgeted other time for other things, but I'm happy to answer. I'll stay as long as you need to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. So as that last part did roll quickly, if you have any questions, use the chat function to type them on in. We don't have any questions waiting at the moment, but I know sometimes when we get to the end of one of these programs, it takes folks a second to type them in. A couple of thank you notes coming in for the presentation. So thank you, Joe. Best webinar all year, so useful. So again, Joe, greatly appreciate your time here today. We'll wait just a couple of What's that?
I said, I love when my mom logs on. Thanks, Mom. Appreciate that.
Someone has noted that they can't download the PDF. If anybody else is having a problem with this, please do let me know. I think the alternative, if you're having any problem using the handout section on this, is again to go to the Main Street Now conference website, which is eventmobi.com/mainstreetnow19. And there you can search for this presentation among many others from the Main Street Now conference to make sure that you are able to download that PDF. Will be there longer term than it is available in the handout section here. So one question that came in: what kinds of strategies do you use with property owners who do not want to work with a realtor but represent their properties themselves?
Ooh. Honestly, you got to kind of judge that on a case-by-case basis. You may be working with a property owner who really happens to know their property. Most times, though, you're going to deal with a property owner who is really emotionally connected to their property and thinks it's worth way more than what it is. And there's a reason why they're not working with a realtor, because a realtor won't represent them. You got to figure out which one that is. I would say work with them, but be cautious when you do, because you want to make sure that, if you get that information and it's twice the amount of the market value, you want to be diplomatic about how you handle that. So you'd say, I appreciate you thinking your building's that you want $250,000 for your building. Just so you're aware, similar buildings are in our community in downtown have sold for $125,000. So they've sold for half that amount. So we're happy to list that property. Just know that that's twice of what anybody else has asked for that piece of property. So you got to be a little cautious on how you handle that and figure out, where they are in the scale of reasonable to crazy.
All right, thank you, Joe. Another question, so how do you handle business owners who happen to be the worst salespeople for your community?
Don't have them go do that. That's the first thing. I mean, seriously, you want to try to avoid, because there are people who are Debbie Downers, and they don't want to, for one of two reasons. One, they really are negative people, or two, they want to downplay everything, so they see everything else as a threat. And I would just say try not to engage those people in that process. If you're hosting a business, go out of your way not to see that person, because otherwise, because that's what they're going to do. They're just going to crap all over what you're trying to do. And I try to avoid those people as much as possible.
Another question that's come up a couple of times, is there a recording available of this? If you registered for the webinar, which if you're in this right now, you did register, you will receive a link to access the recording afterwards. So please rest assured, if you missed something, you can go back. Another question, what would you suggest on how to deal with property owners that are investors who rent to college students and do not see any reason to change their viewpoints?
Yeah, I live in a college town. We live in East Lansing, Michigan, which is home of Michigan State University. And there's a lot of folks who make essentially slumlords. I hate to say that, but I think part of that is you want to make sure, one, that there's a really good rental inspection process in place with the city. You want to work with them to say, you know what, we want to make sure that our apartments are safe for all people who live there. So a rental inspection program is probably the number one thing I would recommend. And then two is, helping them look at market data. What other possibilities are out there? If they're happy renting to college students, maybe that's okay. But then you got to look at, if the issue that they're renting to college students, is that the issue, or is it the issue is that they're slumlords? Because if they're slumlords, then you got to have a good blight system in place. So your city's really going to have their act together from a rental inspection and from a blight enforcement side. But if it's just college students in general, I don't know if there's a whole lot you can do with them, unless you're going to provide them alternative data so they can see what it might be able to be rent to young professionals, as an example. So it depends on the particular piece of property.
Thank you, Joe. Any suggestions on where to find a good template for a mixed-use building pro forma?
Ooh, okay. There's a number of groups. Actually, there is a Facebook group. I believe it's called Small Developers. I'd have to look it up. And whoever asked this question, send me an email. I'll send you a link. There's a Small Developers group that's on Facebook, and I'm totally blanking on the guy's name who runs it. But if you're familiar with incremental development, the incremental development movement, I know Michigan's got a chapter, but they're all over the country. Basically it's a network of small mom and pop developers. And they share information like pro forma templates and design templates and those sorts of things. So, and it's not just mixed use, it's residential, duplexes, quadplexes, that kind of stuff too, missing middle type of housing. So it'd be near downtown type of stuff, but they also do mixed use. So email me and I'll send you the link to the group. I believe it's Small Developers, but for some reason I'm blanking on the exact name of the group.
Wonderful. That's very helpful. I also want to note that the National Main Street Center, through our Main Street America Institute, does have an ongoing partnership with the National Development Council to offer a historic real estate finance training. More news will be coming out about do that. More news will be coming out about that for next year, coming up within the next couple of weeks here. We hope to start getting announcements out about dates and locations for fiscal 2020. So if you're interested in a really intensive course on pro formas, tax credits, and everything in between, that is a good resource for you.
I'm thrilled. Kelly, I want to throw an endorsement, a completely unsolicited endorsement for that, because this is the type of training that I think that National Main Street bringing to Main Street communities is incredibly important. I personally have gone through NDC and I have done their EDFP training. So it's a next level up, is the Economic Development Finance Professional Training. It is, it's essentially a master's course, for lack of another term. But so going through the historic preservation would probably be like an additional bachelor's degree, just because it's so incredibly valuable. If you want to know how real estate pro formas work, if you want to know how projects work, if you have any interest in that whatsoever, go through that program, because that you will learn way more than you ever thought you could about how all this stuff works.
And you'll burn a lot of rubber erasing your hand-done calculations throughout the day. So we look forward to having you there, and I'll make sure that everybody that's listening to this program receives additional information about that. A last question that's come in, it might be our last. Is there any easy way to reach out to national franchises?
No, don't. If I knew, I wouldn't even tell you, to be honest. I think that's a really, really bad idea. Just because I think, one, if the market's there, they'll find you. But two, you don't want to. I think that's bad for your local economy. I don't like big boxes at all. Matter of fact, if you look at the average square footage of, say, like a Walmart or whatever big box in that same category of 100,000 square feet, they extract about $5 to $10 million a year out of your community net. That's less taxes, that's less payroll, that's less everything else. They will extract between $5 and $10 million a year per building in your community, out of your community. It's a giant sucking sound. I would not encourage it in the least.
Well, thank you, Joe. That puts an end to that. There is some, couple of comments that's come in about disagreeing because maybe some of those stores have later business hours. We didn't really talk about business hours totally, but is there a strategy you would think of then to helping kind of your local stores keep their lights on later?
The best thing that I've ever done is I've worked with businesses that in districts in the past. Your census commute data, and that data is updated. These are estimate data. So I'm going to say, I'm trying to remember what the most recent one was. Probably, I think 2017 that we've used. You want to take a look at where your commute patterns are and be able to share that with your retailers of when people are in town and when they're not. And it's really important that in that commute data that you can find through, I believe it's through the U.S. Census, census.gov. In that commute data, they have information in terms of what times a day people are leaving and how long they're gone and how far they're going. And I'll give you an example. I served on a downtown board about 10, 15 years ago, and we had a florist that wasn't open late and she closed at 5 o'clock. And I pulled the census information because I thought it was weird. And I told her, I said, you realize that the average commute time for people in our community is 35 minutes. I said, so even if they worked 8 to 5 and they got out at 5 o'clock and you stayed open until 5:30, there's a good chance they can't make it to your store before you close. And so what she started doing, she thought that really kind of impacted her. So she started opening an hour or two later and then staying open an extra hour or two. And then lo and behold, after about a month or two of staying open, is that she started to see sales after 5 o'clock, after 6 o'clock, that she didn't think was there because she just didn't think about it, to be honest. So being able to show them commute pattern data from your community makes it very real. It's not just you should stay open later because that's what national chains do. You need to show them kind of why that is for your particular community, and that's largely because of commute patterns.
Wonderful. So thank you, everyone, for your participation today. I don't see any additional questions coming in at this moment. I did want to remind everyone that there is one more program in our conference Rewind Recap series coming up on May 29th at 1 p.m. Central, using social media to tell your downtown story. This is with our friend Megan Chewy of Red Wing Main Street in Minnesota. Megan was on this program earlier, and I was going to have her say hello, but she has jumped off. So anyway, if you are interested in registering for that, you can find information and a link to that on our website at mainstreet.org. Once again, thank you so much, Joe. And
thanks,
also,
guys.
Thank you to all of the audience for all the great questions and comments to help make this a robust discussion.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.